So I'll talk a little bit about end rot, or specifically blossom end rot. Now, typically we get our blossom end rot, which is when our tomatoes or peppers start forming. The bottoms of it will start to rot before the vegetable has developed. Sometimes the vegetable can be even green, dark green, and it starts rotting from the bottom up. And there's basically four reasons for that. It can be a overwatering issue, a underwatering issue, a soil issue, or a fertilizing issue. Um, Now, I want you guys to think back to when I talked about the blueberry or the yellow leaves on blueberries. I think it was the very first video I ever did. And I talked about analyzing the problem first, then you can find a solution for it. And so before you go out and buy something like CalMag to give it the extra calcium it needs, because blossom end rot means that there's a calcium deficiency. And one thing about calcium is it needs calcium and magnesium together because it works hand in hand in order to work and combine together in order to allow the tomato plant or pepper plant the additional calcium it needs so that blossom end rot doesn't occur. But before you go out and buy this CalMag, which I really like a lot, just make sure you analyze the problem first. So let's go into analyzing the problem. Now, you're going to typically see blossom end rot mostly on tomatoes and occasionally on like bell peppers and other pepper plants. Now, what happens is you got to figure out, is it a overwatering, underwatering soil problem or a fertilizing problem before you go out and start pumping it full of more calcium. Now, going into the situation, if you overwater your plants can actually start drowning. So if you tend to have pots or raised beds or even in the garden area, if you're going ahead and overwatering your area or your pots too much, it ends up drowning the roots of the plant. It can't get the oxygen, and it doesn't have the ability to uproot the calcium that's in the soil and use it as a viable source. And so that's why overwatering is so bad. Now, on the flip side of that, underwatering. If you underwater your tomato plants, of course, with no additional water in there, it's not able to uptake in the root system all the nutrients that are already in the soil in order to give it the calcium it needs, and that's why blossom end rot occurs. Now, going into the overwatering and underwatering, make sure you use constant watering, consistent watering. Don't let it get too dry. Let it get too wet. And especially in the middle part of the summer where it can get dry in midday, you may need to water twice or three times, but don't overwater. Now, you want to do deep watering versus shallow watering because there are roots down below and they might not be able to uptake the calcium from very bottom of your pot or your raised bed or garden. And so you want to do a deep watering, but don't drown your soil on a daily basis. And so overwatering is still not a good thing. And we tend to see overwatering more, of course, in pots, but you can still overwater in your raised bed or your garden area. So once you figured out, hey, am I giving it consistent water, but not overwatering and underwatering, then we can eliminate that problem. The next portion is, of course, the soil. And I've told you before many times, you can't take the soil in your raised bed or your garden or specifically in your pots and reuse them the following season. I usually go at least 2 seasons before I use the soil again. Tomatoes are heavy feeders. They take the nutrients from the soil, but also it just does a chemical reaction that's a little bit different. And so you should not be using the same soil to grow tomatoes in back-to-back years. I usually give it 2 years fully of not using the same soil. Now, because I like my tomatoes to grow well and healthy, I just go ahead and use specific potting mix that has some nutrients already in it. And you want to go ahead and monitor the type of soil you're buying. Make sure that it's specific for what your purpose is. So if you're doing a raised bed, buy raised bed potting mix. If you're using pots, use potting mix. And if you're using a regular garden, you need to amend your soil before you get started. So making sure the soil situation is really critical. In areas where you have more acidic soil, that's definitely not in my area. It's not in the Pacific Northwest area, but some areas have higher acidic soil, and in those areas, it kind of hinders the ability um, for the uptake of the calcium, and so you want to make sure that you don't over acidify your soil. And on the same side, you also don't want to have too high of an alkaline soil. And so monitor your soil mix. Make sure that it's within the range. Most tomato plants are around 7 pH or slightly lower. You don't want it too acidic. You don't want it too alkaline. Also, buying the specific soil for the specific purpose is very important, because bad soil composition will cause the roots to have a hard time uptaking the nutrients there are. Plus, if you use regular soil back-to-back years, or you're using recycled soil that hasn't been fully neutralized, where there's more nutrients and compost over time getting into the system, you're basically using bad soil to begin with, and it's not going to have nutrients in there, so there's no nutrients to uptake. Now, the last thing is the fertilizing. I just did a video on fertilizing. And one thing about vegetable gardens is we don't want to overdo stuff. I see people overdoing stuff all the time, whether it's overwatering, over fertilizing, giving it too much sun. Overdoing different aspects is not good. So more is not better when it comes to a vegetable garden. So with the fertilizing, make sure you don't over fertilize, because over fertilizing, especially on the three main growing mediums that are needed, the NPK, the nitrogen, potash, and potassium, we want to make sure that that we're within the right ranges of that. Now, when you over fertilize, the potassium in the system goes up too high, and it really hinders the ability for the calcium to uproot. And so that's why we don't want to over fertilize. So if you're overwatering, underwatering, you're using a bad soil composition, or you're over fertilizing, those things alone are what's causing your tomato plants, and possibly your pepper plants and bell pepper plants, from being able to uptake and take that calcium that's already there. There is no deficiency in the calcium in the soil, but it's not able to take that uproot and use it as a viable source. Now, in my particular situation, I know through my hydroponic methods, because as you know, I do a lot of my growing in hydroponics, but I also noticed in my pots, although I use fresh soil, fresh potting mix soil, by the time I got to the mid-season portion, a lot of the nutrients were already gone from there, and so I did have to hit it with additional fertilizer. But even then, with a water-soluble fertilizer, with the water solution mix I use here in my hydroponics, there are times where I need an extra boost of calcium, especially when there's a lot of tomatoes on my plant. I didn't see so much of a end rot problem on my cherry tomatoes, but I definitely saw them in my beefsteak and my big boy tomatoes. And so what I do is I add a shot of calcium magnesium plus, which is specific for tomatoes or anything that gets end rot. I use a syringe to measure out the recommended amount, and I add that to my solution mix, but it would be the same thing. I would add it to my water soluble mix or my watering. I would go ahead and add the Cal Mag into a gallon of water and use as directed to give it the additional calcium magnesium mix that is needed to make sure that it doesn't have my plants that are forming aren't going to get blossom end rot. Now, this is where I told you before about the blueberry plants with the yellow leaves, addressing the situation, analyzing the situation first before you just pump your vegetable garden with CalMag. Make sure you're not overwatering, make sure you're not underwatering, make sure you're using good soil, okay, and you're not over fertilizing. If you're doing all those things already, then you know that you're probably getting blossom end rot because there's not enough calcium magnesium in your mix in your soil. And so you'll go ahead and you'll use a syringe or something to get the appropriate measurements or the size, and then go ahead and put in that solution into your whatever watering method you use, whether you use buckets or a any container to water, go ahead and put that into the water, and then you can go ahead and water your tomato plants. And so that's a little bit about adding the CalMag because there is a calcium deficiency with most tomatoes. And by adding that, you'll go ahead and eliminate the end rot, the blossom end rot, and your tomatoes will form healthy and it won't start rotting from the bottom up. And so that's a little bit about blossom end rot. If you have questions, just let me know.